It's my extreme pleasure to introduce Professor Laurence Grove. Billy is Professor of French and Text Image Studies at the University of Glasgow, where he serves as Director of the Stirling Maxwell Centre for the Study of Text Image Cultures. He's the author of the seminal comics in French, the bande dessinée. And last but not least, he is the unabashed supporter of the exciting soccer/football club of Partick Thistle. So please join me in welcoming our dear Billy Grove. Billy.
Hey, up the Jags.
Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Francois. I didn't expect to get a Partick Thistle supporter in Philadelphia. There you go. Can everyone, can you all hear me okay? Just check on the, yeah, good. And just a huge thank you to Francois and to your class, Francois. It's a real pleasure to be in Philadelphia, albeit virtually. And thank you for the organization you've put into this. I'll now try the sharing of screen. Okay, so can you all see something that should look like? Yep. Okay. The first thing to say is obviously thank you to Francois and to Villanova, but also to say that the current talk is based on one that I gave in Leicester on the 13th of March 2020. Yeah, the world was a bit of a different place then. We all sat around in a room and we talked to each other, and then you left on a train. So a big thank you to Francisca and to Simon for organizing that, and obviously not minding the fact that I'm taking this and then updating it for today. The title, right, why read Tintin, is problematic, and I'm sure you're aware of that. It's problematic because first of all, it might seem like it's an apology for Tintin, but I'm saying to you, yes, you must read Tintin, especially when you've got Snowy sat behind me. Well, it's not that at all. It's problematic because how on earth can you cover everything to be said about Tintin in 45 minutes? And it's problematic because of the very nature of Tintin. It's starting, if we start on a microcosm level with this poster, which Francois and I discussed. The poster as it originally was on the top left, is there implicit racism there? If you then change it to the final poster, which is the one on the bottom right, does it then become okay? But I'm not going to have exact answers to these, but these are the type of questions which Tintin, and in this particular example, Tintin au Congo, bring up. So in asking why read Tintin, it's not going to be like a Tintin adventure where you get to the end of the story and the book closes and you say, see, that's the solution to the mystery. Unless, of course, you're reading Les Bijoux de la Castafiore or maybe Alpha, which are more complicated. But what I am hoping to do is to raise questions. I'm hoping as well to maybe make some unexpected connections and even tell you one or two things that even those of you who know Tintin inside out might not know. So it's an exploration, if anything, and I hope that by the end of it, the conclusion will be, well, let's read Tintin and reject rather than let's reject and not read. You should have available a handout. So Francois has given the link to that, and the handout will give you many of the references that I'll be giving today, as well as being a little bit enigmatic, as I like to be. During this, I'll be following the chat, and at times, if there are questions to be thrown in, that's great. That's what it's all about. It's one of the advantages of the online Zoom way of doing things, is that we can have this dual interaction. Okay, so but let's start with things a little bit differently. With Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Yeah, I know you're probably thinking, hang on a minute, have I come to the wrong place here? Referring to fan approaches. So these are academics who are fans who make a living out of watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Jason Mittel points out that Buffy studies, and there's a journal of Buffy studies called Slayage, but Buffy studies has lasted longer than the TV series itself. Being a little bit cynical, Jason Mittel intimates that the primary purpose of such studies might just be to fill CVs and to keep academics doing something. And he asks, would the world what would be lost if Buffy studies were dismantled? He takes it one further, and he then goes on to Lego studies. And he has written the final piece to this book on Lego studies. And he suggests that Lego studies could not be or should not be constituted as a discipline. And rather that inherently interdisciplinary approaches should be allowed to construct and to deconstruct. I love you language like that, construct and deconstruct. It's great, but it's even better when you're talking about Lego. So it should be allowed to construct and deconstruct an ad hoc corpus beyond disciplinary restraints. What the point of all this is, you're probably thinking, well, what's all this got to do with Tintin? Well, it's in a university context, which we all know and we all love. And so the age-old question is, well, if in a university we're allowed to watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer, if in a university we're allowed to play with Lego, can we read Tintin? Well, of course we can, and we know that, and it's an old question. But I think the next stage of the question is to say how, why, and in what context do we read Tintin? So that's the first element, is what I might call, in a university context, a familiar walk in the woods, raising questions with which we're familiar and just making sure that they are there. The place of Tintin in an academic context. Like any Tintin adventure, we'll then go from the walk in the woods and the nice questions to which with which we're all familiar to something a little bit more adventurous. And so I'm going to try, and having questioned or at least looked at the nature and status of academic disciplines, go off on an adventure and look more specifically at the influence of Tintin. Tintin, first of all, the notion of Tintin and Tintin studies, the influence of Tintin on the bande dessinée, specifically French language comics, but then perhaps comics as a whole, and the ambiguities of that influence. And then go a little bit further, and the influence of Tintin on culture worldwide. Be coming back at the end of the adventure to home, or at least home for me, trying to find some sort of solution to what this all might mean, or where we can find an answer. And I'll be going in search of the Black Island, the famous Tintin adventure that takes him to Scotland. So any sort of quick questions on any of this so far? So the overview is to basically to ask questions, first of all, about why we might approach Tintin, before taking you on a little adventure which looks at some of the influences worldwide, both in terms of comics and beyond comics. So, no, okay. So Tintin and Tintin or Tintinologue, why, or those basically who study Tintin, should we be doing this in a university, or should it just be in fairs, in comic cons, in collectibles? Does Hergé resist the confines of academic institutionalization, which is another way of raising the same question? Now, Tintin is, of course, very different from Buffy and from Lego, not least because there is no Lego Tintin. I thought I'd just point that out. Part of this is to take you off on little tangents. And although there is Steven Spielberg-inspired Lego in the Indiana Jones boxes, the only Tintin Lego we get is the Tintin that's put together by fans. But fans have put Lego together and created Moulin Sart, the castle, and they've created the boat. So perhaps one of the initial questions is, well, who's to say who's in charge here? Isn't Tintin the very discipline that allows us to remove the traditional gatekeepers and have it fan run rather than run by people in gowns in universities? There are nonetheless a plethora of fan forms, not just the Moulin Sart and the Licorne, but in other popular domains. The study of Tintin is that of a popular icon, not traditionally associated with academic high culture. And here we're going back maybe to Buffy and going back to Lego. It mixes disciplines that include literature, narratology, fine art, political history, sociology, and film studies. Tintin, like Buffy and like Lego, has fan culture, spin-off products, and I'm sure you can see a few of those behind me. It had media presence. People seem to like Tintin. If you want to get your name in the newspapers, say something about Tintin and they'll phone you up. And of course, it has a pirated paraphernalia. All of these might be seen as intended for the young, as indeed Buffy and Lego, but all in fact appeal to all ages. The difference might be that whereas Buffy and Lego are late 20th century phenomena, Tintin spans the 20th century and has an attraction via an evolving sociological and historical context that goes well beyond that of fandom. Or another way of looking at it is just to say, well, what attracts us to studying and to reading Tintin? It's that je ne sais quoi, it's that I don't know, it's the je dirais même plus, the catchphrase of the Dupont, Thompson and Thompson, where they say je dirais même plus, and I'll tell you more, and then they don't say anything more. So maybe that encapsulates Tintin as this hard to seize phenomenon, which we know is there, but we can't quite understand what the attraction is. As an object of study, Tintin overshadows all other aspects of bande dessinée, of French comics. And a quick browse along the shelves of an academic library, in this case it's Glasgow University Library, done in happier times, obviously. I would say that the Tintin section covers approximately 10% of the physical area of all bande dessinée or even comics in general. And this will obviously vary from library to library, but it's clear that Hergé and Tintin are well overrepresented in terms of academic studies. Now, this selection includes primary texts, it includes historical reprints of primary texts, it includes biographies of the author, it includes a range of academic approaches which go from psychological to post-colonial to structuralist, and with contributions ranging from those of up-and-coming scholars to members of the Académie Française. It has been quite a favorite with members of the Académie. So in this way, Tintin replicates even somebody as worthy as Marcel Proust à la recherche du temps perdu. And we might ask, is it just not the same old canon, but different? Now, this question of the canon is one to which I will return. But before then, let's go on to Tintin and the bande dessinée world. Are any, just to check if there are any immediate questions coming up. No Lego Tintin. There is no Sue. There is no official Tintin Lego. Nice to see people from all over the world. Brilliant. Okay. Tintin and the bande dessinée world. The relevance of Tintin to the world of bande dessinée, or indeed of comics. It's a bit like the relevance of Shakespeare to theatre. And this is the stage where I can only throw out a few examples, a few pointers, and the comics experts amongst you will know this off by heart. First of all, I'll look then at direct stylistic influences, the way in which Hergé has been referred to by others in the field. Then broader stylistic influences, so taking it out a bit further. And then what is perhaps just as important is the anti-influence. When Tintin does something and people say, we shouldn't be doing that, we should be doing the opposite. So it is influencing by taking culture in a different direction. So for direct stylistic influences, we could easily mention the work, and I'm picking some really obvious ones here, but the work of Edgar Pierre Jacobs, who was a friend of Hergé. He worked with him on the coloured reworkings of the early Tintin albums, and then on later storylines such as Le Temple du Soleil. And in 1946, he then created the Blake et Mortimer series, just to point out that Blake is a graduate, according to this, of Glasgow University. Is it Blake or Mortimer? Never quite remember. Anyway, so the Blake and Mortimer series, which in itself has become an icon in comic studies. So we have Tintin, Hergé creating Tintin, influencing Jacobs, Jacobs creating the next stage, which then goes on to influence. So it's the building up of influences which we get in all forms of culture. For direct references in contemporary comics, we might take Charles Burns, which I'm sure many of you know, or one example, less well known but equally valid, is the Belgian-Israeli author Michel Kishka, who was in fact invited to the Leicester Conference, and throughout his work will refer directly to Tintin. So these are just picking out a few of the examples. More broadly, Tintin magazine, and I've got some copies here, Tintin magazine, which ran from 1946 until 1993, created and promoted team-based comics, serial publications, and the promoting of lesser-known artists. So although the star artist was Hergé or Hergé Studios and Tintin, other artists would then get space in this journal. So to some extent, Tintin then led the way for journals such as Pilote, but also Mad, Raw, and so on. And we could say that the whole base of comics depended on this journal format. In terms of broader stylistic influences, we could talk about the ligne claire, the clean line, the clear line, which is now associated inseparably with Tintin. The idea that there is no shading, that the clearness of the artwork represents the clearness of the thoughts. And that could be a conference in itself. It could be a whole talk in itself, the clear line. Again, we could refer to influences on Charles Burns, Michel Kishka, but we might add maybe Chris Ware, whom I'm sure you all know, or why not, and I believe he's present, Frank Quitely, who's All-Star Superman, very much picks up on the clear line style of Hergé. And indeed, Frank Quitely said, Tintin and his chums are rendered simply to allow us more easily to project ourselves into the stories, but being drawn into the environments and adventures of Tintin book is, at the hands of a master like Hergé, simply inevitable. So one of the main authors of today, one of the best-selling DC authors, will say that he was influenced directly by Hergé and Tintin. From Frank Quitely, we can go to Andy Warhol. We can take it further out, the influence on pop art, this famous image of Hergé with Andy Warhol, and the paintings, the works, the portraits of Hergé done by Warhol. So we could take it one step further and say that the late 20th century art movements all owe it to Warhol, if we want to be reductive, and Warhol owes it all to Hergé. What I would say is that a quick look around any art gallery, and I reckon you'll get something which, subliminally or not, will represent the ideas behind Tintin. So I went to Kelvin Grove, which is one of the Glasgow museums, Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum, and this work by Anthony Green, it struck me as this is doing exactly the same sort of thing. It's telling a story. It's a story of a broken vase. It's got compartmentalized frames. It's playing around with the layout. It's got clear line. I'm sure that in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, you'll be able to find paintings that do exactly this type of thing, which pick up, consciously or otherwise, on the influence of Hergé indirectly. Tintin can also be an embedded reference that goes beyond Tintin. There was a recent PhD by Amma Mirza on translations of Tintin in the Arab world. And the point that Ammar made was that Arab readers believe that Tintin is one of them, that part of Arabic comic history, and it's an extremely convincing argument that Ammar makes, so that he is not this translated Belgium, he is part of world culture. And stylistically, of course, there is the anti-influence. Now, this comes in terms of pastiche. For some reason, Tintin seems to be the subject of fun poking galore. And some of these, I hope you're not going to find them offensive, but they do tend to be taboo breaking and often sexual. It might be precisely because what is there that is less sexual than Tintin, so let's make Tintin sexual. But Tintin also tends to be used for current affairs, be it football hooliganism in England, Les Bijoux de la Kardashian, or what's going on in the world at the moment. And one of the questions might be, why is it that seems to be that Tintin lends himself to this more than other comic figures or figures of comics? It is, as I've said, the squeaky cleanness, and one example is Jan Bouquet, and I hope you're not offended by this, but it was said that there are only two ways to offend people in Belgium, is either by having a go at Tintin or a royal family, and Jan Bouquet did exactly that by his La vie sexuelle de Tintin, Tintin's sex life, which seemed to be the ultimate taboo breaking. Jean-Christophe Menu, who led the association, which was the publishing house that created alternative bande dessinée, included such publications as Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, has always said that as a kid he used to read Tintin. The influence is there, but again, this is very much an anti-influence. In this book, which is a credo, a manifesto, Menu talks about the traditional 48-page album, what he calls 48 cc caca, 48 pages, color, hard-bound caca. And what Menu says is we should all be doing something different from Tintin, and consciously so. So maybe the main reason for reading Tintin is to say that he enabled the thriving alternative bande dessinée scene that is marking the ninth art at the moment. Just have a quick look if there are any. Are all of these comics listed with Hergé as the author? Good question. In the later albums by Hergé, it was a studio work, but it would always be given by Hergé as author. For instance, for Charles Burns things, no, but I don't think Hergé even gets mentioned, although the influence, or for Chris Ware, is obviously there direct. Any other questions?
And what about the pastiche? Are those voluntarily titled Hergé, even though it's not him?
Yeah, excellent question. They tend to be anonymous just because there are copyright issues, but Moulin Sarr, the people who own the copyright to Tintin, are known to be stringent, and these are very much pirated underground things. And so Hergé is put there as part of the pastiche. And generally with these, the author isn't given. Okay, yeah, Tintin in America. Why is the influence of the Journal de Tintin on the existence of other comics magazines so great? It's an excellent question. I think it is this idea of taking an icon, which was Tintin, and then building a journal around it, so people would buy it for Tintin and then discover other things, which was a formula which was then followed in other journals, both in France and throughout the world. Yeah, there was the Tintin-Spirou rivalry, and then later when Pilote came along, it was presented that Tintin and Asterix were the rivals, and in the 2018 World Cup, the semi-final between Belgium and France was posted as being Tintin contre Astérix. Okay, well, let's look at wider cultural influences, not just stylistic influences, but content as well as form. I'd like to say that Tintin is essentially James Bond without the girls. And I'm using the term girls deliberately here in reference to the term Bond girls, and deliberately in reference to the fact that that's one of the most problematic aspects of Tintin, which we'll be coming back to, is the role of women, or the lack of role of women in Tintin, which is also a problematic aspect of James Bond. But what we'll be looking at here is the influence, and so that certain adventure narratives of the 20th century, which have become very much part of everyone's culture, like them or hate them, we can at least put them back to Tintin and see where they're coming from. So Tintin is the archetype for the modern adventure narrative, and I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new for many of you, but sometimes we just don't think it through and look at the exact details and how close they are. So Tintin is known, of course, like James Bond, for his chases that involve trains, planes, automobiles. Tintin is known for his gadgets. Here we have the microfilm hidden in the umbrella. Tintin is known for these cliffhanger endings. What's going to happen? Will the world be destroyed? And then when we turn the page, we find out that in fact it's just a model, not a real city. Tintin, like James Bond, travels the world and beyond. They both go to the moon, in fact. And Tintin, like James Bond and other adventure heroes, very much plays on the idea that the adventure and the thrill can be toned down by the use of humor. That's why we enjoy the film. We get excited about, will the baddies get away with it? Then something funny happens. And the funny can be linguistically funny, que ça saute, which then leads to the bottle popping, or just visual slapstick, as in this case. I would say that Tintin, like James Bond, like many of the other extraordinary heroes that are part of our culture, rely on the fact, and this is from Superman onwards, that there is a duality. Tintin functions due to duality. And if you want to see more on this, there's the article on the handout by Umberto Eco, which talks about Superman. The reason we like Superman is because there's Clark Kent. We can all identify with Clark Kent, and maybe think, as we've got our boring life in an office, that we might go out and save the world. Well, Tintin too has his everyday walk in the park, and we would say that we can all identify with the everyday Boy Scout. The minimalistic face features that allow us to project whatever physical appearance we might like. And indeed, one of the suggestions for the latest Spielberg film was that it is so generic that Tintin could change sex, but he doesn't have to be masculine. But at the same time, he can go for a walk in the park, or he can run along a speeding train. He can survive shooting. He can escape capture. He can bring villains to justice. So it's this duality. And the duality works so well in comics because comics is based on duality of form. So we have the ordinary Tintin, Boy Scout, and the hero, just in the same way that we have the text, which will put the story forward, to be contrasted with the image, which allows us to reflect upon descriptions and ideas and to get feelings in there. So the duality, the text image form, where text advances actions, image provide ambiance for us to ponder. Is Corto Maltese the ultimate anti-Tintin? Laurent, that's an excellent question. There's an article on that in a very recent issue of European Comic Art, and one of the short answer is yes. Ellie, the adaptability of Tintin in the situation plot line is the comic's greatest strength. Exactly, but it's as if I'd paid you to say that, but it still follows a formula, and I'll talk about the formula. Guillaume, how popular, influential was Tintin in the early years in the Petit Vingtième in the 1930s? Hugely, to the extent that Tintin became this cult figure. Happenings were organized where somebody would dress up as Tintin and would come into Brussels, and crowds would be waiting for the Tintin lookalike. People would await the next episode, and according to the figures we have, it was really one of the biggest sellers. The only reason that Tintin isn't the biggest selling book series in the world, and that I believe is Asterix, is that Tintin stopped selling after stopped being, there were no new ones after Hergé's death, but we'll come back to that. But to pick up on what Ellie is saying there, the adaptability of Tintin is part of what happens. So the plot line will always change around, but it's using a steady formula. The steady formula follows more or less the schema that is catalogued by Vladimir Prop, which is on the handout. Vladimir Prop talked about Russian folk tales and said in short that most stories in modern fiction will follow the same schema. That domestic stability opens the tale, to be followed by a challenge to the status quo, then cliffhanger danger, followed by a turnaround solution, and then finally the return to stability. It's a formula that keeps the audience gripped, and we always wonder how the formula will be adapted. And it's a formula which can be used and reused exactly as Hergé understood, as had those who influenced him, specifically, let's say, John Buckham, another Glasgow student. I don't just keep throwing in Glasgow students for the sake of it, who influenced the Black Island story, also influenced Ian Fleming, and influenced Alfred Hitchcock. And these in turn were the influence upon L'Île Noire, which I'll be coming back to. This is a formula which in turn helps us understand much of the narrative adventure fiction that has marked popular culture into the 21st century, from the evolving James Bond to Indiana Jones to Scooby-Doo and, yes, of course, Buffy the Vampire. Now, we might not like this fiction, and we might say this fiction portrays a world which has its exclusions, and I think that's entirely true. But at least knowing where Tintin comes from means we know where the exclusions come from, and then we can be aware of it as we take it on to the next level. So we've got Damon. When I was young, I remember finding Asterix in a frame in Tintin and the Picaros. I think it might be the other way round, that Tintin appears in Astérix chez les Belges, and Tintin certainly was an influence upon Goscinny and Uderzo. And the second part of the question, the relevance of the Tintin Spirou rivalry driving production. Yes, and sorry, I did miss that out. You're absolutely right. But Tintin magazine was then it had this arch rival, which was Spirou, and to some people it was almost seen as being the difference between France and Belgium, although it wasn't. They were both Belgian, and it was the difference of some people were saying that Spirou was the new bande dessinée of the 1950s, of the style atome, whereas Tintin was the previous fashion. Yep, and the Dupont were also in Asterix. Yep. Okay. More broadly, however, let's look at some other. Damon, I would like to see the frame of seeing Tintin et les Picaros. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Cultural examples going beyond adventure fiction are also numerous. Let's start with Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle is quoted as saying, and this is quite a famous quote, Au fond, vous savez, Mon seul rival international, c'est Tintin. You know that my only true international rival is Tintin. This idea of a person who dominated the press, who had this iconic status. Tintin is associated with European politics and specifically, increasingly, with Brexit politics. Tintin is often seen as a quintessential European, although that creates the question of, well, is he Belgian? He is from Brussels, or is he European? He does have there are references to certain linguistic tics of Brussels, but he almost seems to be a European everyman. The poster you have here, Tintin and the Brexit plan, apparently adorned the walls of the Brussels office as Brexit negotiations were going through. In prose literature, we might refer, and this is just a quick example which I came across, in L'Étranger by Albert Camus, there's a character called Raymond, whose speech tic is to say, je dirais même plus, and then he doesn't say anything. I can't help but believe that Camus took this directly from Tintin and the Dupont et Dupont, the Thompson twins. Raymond represents to some extent the absurdity of life, the fact that we all try to communicate with each other and we cannot communicate. Maybe that's what Hergé was getting across from the Dupont, the fact that we can't communicate. And at the end of it, life is a bit meaningless, so let's just have a good laugh. We can philosophize about all of these things if we like. Alternatively, Tintin might just be seen as a fashion icon. His clothes have almost become known as Tintin clothes. And again, Kishka refers to le pantalon de golf à la Tintin. So if we see that, we recognize it. It's this creation, once again, of icons. And then there's this one, just in the chat. Any of you know what the reference is here? What has she got to do with all of this? I mean, I'm sure you'll recognize Greta. Okay. Well, the answer is her middle name is Tintin. There are a series of books called Greta Tintin. Her parents were absolutely mad, continue to be mad Tintin fans. So I'd like to think that she must have grown up with the influence of Tintin. Now, the next stage is to say, well, is her ecological fight influenced in any way by Tintin? Well, I'm not quite sure of that, because Tintin certainly does travel the world, unlike Greta. But it's a text image puzzle, a bit like the handout, which I'm hoping is going to keep us guessing. Any other questions so far? The carnival scene in the Picaros might be where the asterisk reference is. Yes. Oh, it's brilliant. I'm going to have to check that out. Any other questions, or before I get onto the slightly more awkward, I'll stop just to see if, or if anyone wants to put their, oh, Greta travels by sailboat. Any general questions? No, okay. In any case, if after this you've got any questions, you've got my email, and I'd be more than happy, it goes without saying, to take questions by email. But it's not all positive stuff. And indeed, one of the main problems with Tintin is why we shouldn't read Tintin. And here we go back to the question of the poster, and maybe the notion of read and reject. Tintin, as we have seen, comes to represent mainstream, staid, ironically unadventurous bande dessinée. But it's more than that. We might add sexist. The only female character who comes to the fore in Tintin is the Castafiore, who is not a very sympathetically portrayed character. There's a large absence of female characters, which could be said to be entirely indicative of 20th century fiction, adventure fiction. The racism elements in Tintin au Congo cannot be denied, and brings up the whole question of, well, if we've got an oeuvre, do we go into how far back or how forgiving can we be or not be with an author? Similarly, with anti-Semitic to the extent of being pro-Nazi in some of the albums. To return to our earlier question, that of the canon, Les Aventures de Tintin, as the creation of a dead white straight male, could appear to have all the shortcomings we might historically associate with a prescribed list of great works. And just as Shakespeare is marked by having a terminus ad quem, and that's just a way of saying we know with Shakespeare that he stopped, we're not going to get any new Shakespeare, so that is true of Tintin. Part of Hergé's legacy was to say that there will be no new Tintin albums after his death. So in this respect, Tintin differs from James Bond, from Superman, or from Asterix. And is it that no further existence that gives him that little extra je ne sais quoi and the appeal? That said, although Tintin is canonical in that sense, he is not from metropolitan France, and the later albums were very much studio creations. And above all, Tintin may be canonical, but he is canonical within a subject area, the bande dessinée, which, for various reasons, breaks the canon. The study of bande dessinée, perhaps like cinema studies before it, has taken time to develop, going from a fan base to various degrees of institutionalization, without necessarily finding a natural disciplinary home, which is where we come back to Lego and Buffy studies. In Philadelphia, comics are accepted as a valid area of university study, and it's increasingly so in France, although it's taken time in France. And in France, the tradition remains that of festivals and popular press. All of this in a context where the traditional canon is challenged. Do we study comics authors or the overall production? What's more important, Hergé or Tintin? And is reception, the way that we read Tintin now, more important than pedestaled creation? Bande dessinée itself raises questions about the nature of culture and learning, the validities of hierarchies, and the criteria by which we select masterpieces. But within such parameters, Les Aventures de Tintin provides traditional answers. As we have seen, Hergé can be admired as a genius in terms of characterization, narrative construction, artwork that arguably influenced the main movements of the 20th century. And the ascendancy of the Boy Scouts' adventures is pervasive to such an extent that it remains a marker, whether it's a marker to be imitated or shunned, throughout contemporary creation and reception of comics. So basically, I've not answered the question at all. All I've said is that Tintin is out there, and what do we do about it? Any questions so far? Any more questions? It's great. Yeah. Castafiore does save Tintin and Haddock in La Faire Tournesol. Yep. So yeah, she's not entirely black and white. Okay, so let me end here with a quick conclusion. I'd like to take you a trip homeward bound, and one of the topic I'm working on at the moment is this nature of the collapse of the canon, how that evolves, and I've come to conclude that literary criticism, for years, going back to the 19th century or even beyond, we've tried to think of it as something empirical, but it's not empirical at all. I would say that literary criticism is all based on what we do as individuals. It's what I call personal journey criticism. And we are influenced by the books we grow up with, by the people we know as kids and the journeys we go on, which is why I'm unashamedly going to be somewhat introspective in this conclusion and show you something, an event that marked me. Quick question from Tony. Would you say that all of the sexism and racism found in these comics, that it's worrisome to have in the world, or is it a good learning experience? Tony, that is an absolutely brilliant question. And it's a question of what do we do with it? What do we do with Tintin au Congo? Do we put it aside and say we don't want anything to do with this? I put it previously on the syllabus at Glasgow on the basis that it's better to know about colonialism than ignore it. And a student came up with a very good point that it's okay to be looking at this stuff, but you shouldn't be asking students to buy the book, because then that's giving money to it, which is a different level. Yeah. And Moulin-Sarr, a quick word to say that Moulin-Sarr has been traditionally known for being very stringent in terms of any type of copyright. One such story was a kid who dressed up as Tintin to do guided tours of Brussels and got sued by Moulin-Sarr. And if they see anywhere my PowerPoint, I'm sure I'll get in trouble anyway. Let me conclude then, to take you on an adventure, to take you home. In 2019, Tintin, a French TV channel, aired a program which was called Les Mystères de Tintin. The one answer is, why should we read Tintin? Because he's on telly. And that seems to be very much part of modern culture. In Les Mystères de Tintin, the young blogger Alex Vizio was sent around Scotland in search of the Black Island Castle. So he'd been to various other places. He was very much the updated version of Boy Scout, very trendy. And he was looking for this. Where was this castle? Yeah. Someone has the mic on. Is anyone got the mic to be muted? Anyway. So Alex was looking for L'Île Noire. The program brought together travel, exoticism, human interest, humor, and an adventure plot. To cut a long story short, the castle is Lochranza Castle, which is on the Isle of Arran. And Bob de Moor, Hergé's friend and associate, had sketched it. He'd been sent to Scotland for the reworked version. And on the handout, you've got the list of the different versions. He'd be sent to Scotland and he sketched Lochranza Castle. So Lochranza is at the top of the Isle of Arran. And for the program, we ended up there. And it provided the scene for the final shot of the program. So let me see if...
Est-ce que je suis trop bas? Non, c'est génial. Bon, ok. Je n'ai peut-être pas trouvé le bon château, mais pour moi, ça ressemble quand même pas mal à la couverture de l'île Noire. Mission accomplie. Et bon, voilà. Et tu sais, Tintin, c'est réaliser son rêve. Exactement. C'est toujours résoudre les énigmes. C'est ça, Tintin. Résoudre les énigmes, même quand il n'y a pas de solution, même quand c'est un mystère, quand c'est moitié imagination, moitié réalité. Mais de le faire toi-même, et tu l'as fait. Attends, s'il y a une araignée qui lâche pas l'affaire, ah bah, je n'allais pas me laisser faire non plus. T'es digne de Tintin. Tintin, il serait fier de toi. Et ça va écouter toi. Oh, arrête, tu dis ça pour le plateau. Qui dit que j'ai mis quelque chose sur mon film? Quand on parle de Tintin, on a forcément des images de voyage dans la tête. Et avec l'île Noire entre les mains, j'ai pu découvrir l'Écosse et ses paysages à couper le souffle. Finalement, l'île Noire, qu'elle soit réelle ou imaginaire, c'est avant tout une formidable invitation au voyage. Pour mieux repartir à l'aventure, à l'autre bout du monde, comme Tintin.
So again, apologies for the indulgent nature of this, but it's to do again with this idea I'm exploring of personal journey criticism, but in the end, all criticism, all cultural references will go back to something that has touched us personally. And working on this film was great fun, and so it touched me personally. Have there been theatrical adaptations of Tintin? Yes, there's a musical, Le Temple du Soleil. Would there be new issues of Tintin? That's a good question. Would it be any... There is something about the mystery of the final album, Alpha, which was left in sketch form by Hergé, and then we go no further than that. But let me conclude here. So what do we get from this search for Tintin's castle? Well, if we look at the sketch by Bob de Moor, we see that it does correspond to the sketch is Lochranza, And then the castle here that is produced for the final 1966 edition is clearly Laurence, but what about this round tower there? That round tower is purely of Hergé's creation. And it goes back to the earlier edition where Hergé, as far as we know, had never been to Scotland, and he was just using his imagination. So the final castle, Black Island Castle, which we have, is a mixture of solved mystery fact, finding the actual castle, Laurence on the Isle of Arran, and then pure imagination, how Hergé had imagined a Scottish castle. It's a mixture of tradition, the tradition of the Scottish castle, and innovation, Hergé coming up with something from his mind. And I think that sums up for me the answer to the question of why read Tintin. It's this idea of bringing together fact, past, imagination, and despite all the problems of which we should be aware when we're reading Tintin, it's something which I think can affect us all individually, as can any literature or cultural manifestation, and it can affect us in a way that brings together things we know added to our own imagination. And I think it's that mixture which allows me to say, I don't know why we should read Tintin, but if you enjoy it, go ahead. And if you don't, don't. So, okay. Are there new color editions? The early ones which were made in black and white, there were 8 black and white initial albums, which were then all colored from 1943 onwards. So all of the albums have been made into color editions. I didn't know that. Jean-Sébastien, there was a puppet show in Montreal. I didn't know that. Okay, I'd be interested to find out more about that. There are reworkings and pastiche of Tintin in Congo. Yes, I mean, the very question of the pastiche of Tintin could be a whole talk in itself. Why Tintin seems to be more open to pastiche than virtually any other bande dessinée that I know of. I think there is the squeaky cleanness about it, but it's also this fact that you create an icon in the same way that the Mona Lisa is an icon, that the Eiffel Tower is an icon, that the Rocky Steps in Philadelphia are an icon, and this status of being an icon goes beyond the actual work itself. Now, then the question is, how and when do you achieve this status? When you talk about imagination, hi Ole, the racist and anti-Semitic imaginations are a decisive part, since they're not only reproduced, but reflected in the functioning. Yes, definitely in the Shooting Star, and in the L'Oreille Cassée as well, I think. And they enable us to understand these imaginations. So it's the idea that if we're not reading racist stuff, we can never understand racists. That's an interesting viewpoint. I'm not sure on that one. Can you walk us through some of your Tintin plushies, especially at the back? Hang on. I'll go and bring them for you. These were a present from Charles Forsyth, who is here. So it's like how you tell somebody you really like them or don't like them. You give them a toy Tintin. I've also, yes. Although I tend to be critical of Tintin, as you can see from around me, I'm one of the people who very much goes in for Tintin paraphernalia, and you can't help now. Is it almost this Tintin does something which you know you shouldn't like it, but you do anyway, almost like James Bond films. Even the most ardent dissenters from James Bond, you can still sit through it and tut about it. Whereas sometimes a Fassbinder film, it's more difficult to sit through and tut, even if you think it's a better film. Any other questions? Is the term graphic novel ever used in relation to Tintin? Graphic novel was a term which was initially, as I understand it, used to differentiate between the comics format and then the format in book form. And it was also used Anne would explain this a lot better than I can, also used in certain circles as a way of justifying or making comics seem more important by association with prose literature. That's a very interesting question. The fact that Tintin, all of the albums initially appeared serialized in comic form, it does tend to mean that Tintin is generally referred to as comics rather than graphic novels. So maybe the answer to that suit is that a graphic novel is something that is created initially for that format, for the book format. Graphic novels also tend, but not always, but they do tend to be one-offs rather than character series. It's not always the case. But I'd not thought about that. Yeah, but I think the answer is that none of them were books before they were serialized, apart from Alpha, which wasn't serialized because it wasn't finished. Maybe mention the concept of the album. Yeah, initially Tintin would appear then with a couple of pages at a time in Le Petit Vingtième and then various other publications. And so you wouldn't get more than a couple of pages. Let's see if I've got any in here. And so the idea is that you'd be hanging on week to week to see what would happen next in the adventure, which is why in the albums of Tintin, often at the end of the 2 pages, there's a cliffhanger, because they were originally published so that you would buy it for next week. After the full adventure had come out in the journal form, as a way of cashing in, basically, it would then be put into albums. So if we take the example of L'Île Noire, it first appeared in Le Petit Vingtième, and then almost as soon as the complete series had come out, it went into an album, a black and white album format. Were all the bande dessinée published in Tintin magazine, published by Casterman? That is an excellent question. All of the albums were published by Casterman. Was Tintin magazine published by Casterman? I'm not sure that it was. This was by Dargaud, I think. So the answer to that is that the albums by Casterman, but not the journals. Liliane, the duality of form of bande dessinée. What aspect of Tintin is dual? That he plays upon text and on image. That when you read a Tintin adventure, you can't just look at the pictures and you can't just read the text, and it's not an illustrated story, it's the two of them interacting. Yep, Balzac also published serial literature. Tony, do you think that the movie that was made about Tintin was accurate? I wasn't that impressed because I thought it was too close to Tintin. It was almost taking the album and then just putting it into animated form. And I think that movies tend to work best, and Guillaume, who is here somewhere, would tell us about that. I think movies tend to work best when they do something different and they play upon the specificities of their own format. A film that just imitates and tells the story of a comic, which is also what happened with the Asterix films, in my view, don't work so well. And the best ones were the ones where they were going away from it. So, for instance, an Asterix film which would make a joke about mobile phones. The journal was Le Lombard. Yes, thank you. Les Éditions du Lombard, that was it. Yeah. The new colorized versions of the original stories are published by Édition Moulinsart without Casterman. Yeah, these are Moulinsart is set up by the héritier of Hergé, so Fanny Rodmel, his second wife, and there have been a lot of litigious embroilings. There's a book by Benoit Peters exactly on the question of the héritier de Hergé. And when we're putting together European comic art, Anne and myself, we know full well that if there's an article on Tintin, you basically can't get any pictures for it. Specifically about the character of Tintin. I mentioned Superman and Clark Kent. Thank you, Liliane. The reason is that when we see Tintin to start with, he's an ordinary boy. We don't quite know how old he is. He's wandering through the park or through the woods. He's got a dog. And so this is something we can all identify with, and you could have been a Boy Scout at that time. But what he then does to make himself extraordinary is he manages to catch the villains, or he dodges the bullets, or he runs along a train, or he gets out of the way of an aeroplane, the type of thing that most of us might wish we could do, but we can't actually do. So it's in a way it's the Indiana Jones. Now, to what extent are these heroes or superheroes? To be a superhero, do you have to have a special power? Whereas just to be a hero, you do things that most people can't do. Tintin and the Capitaine. What is the Capitaine's role? A counter image of Tintin. Yes, there have been various psychoanalytical analyses of this, that he's a father figure, that it's a father figure that represents the father figure that Hergé himself didn't have. There have been sexual readings of the relationship between Tintin and Edgar. So yes, that's another one we could talk about for quite a while. Thank you, Caroline. Very good question. My favorite Tintin adventure, it's the one where he comes to Scotland. I love that. L'Île Noire, for all its problems, for all its cliches. I still think and for me, it's also the album where Tintin changes. When he goes to the Congo, when he goes to America, he tries to put his viewpoint on different people. When he comes to Scotland, he becomes the native and he wears a kilt. So whereas in Tintin au Congo, one of the big problems is that the natives are carrying him around in his Tintin state, by the time he gets to the Île Noire, he's realized that he's better off trying to assimilate to people rather than just boss them around. Maybe I'm being simplistic there, but that's the viewpoint that's one of the reasons why I like L'Île Noire. But again, it goes back to the other thing, is that I live in Scotland, and so it all ends up being personal. What's the significance of the official authorized studies of Tintin published by Moulin Sarre? There is a lot of good scholarship which goes through Moulin Sarre with Moulin Sarre's blessing. And to be honest, they're a lot less stringent than they used to be. It used to be that if you criticized Hergé in any way, if you mentioned the war, if you mentioned questions of collaboration or the albums which have Nazi leanings, there was no way that Moulin Sarre would publish it in any of their publications, and they certainly wouldn't allow you to use any of the images. They're a little less stringent now, but it's still a problem. Do I think the heroism of Tintin is derived from his whiteness or Eurocentric nature? Well, that is problematic, because if we look at Tintin, he represents the classic normality that I think society should be aiming to challenge, and he is all of that. So I don't think his heroism comes from his whiteness. But again, I'm very much in favor of Europe. So I think that anything good about Tintin is to do with what he does for Europe. But again, at least I'm able to say I'm not being objective here. I like him being European because I like Europe. Can anyone be any more objective? I'm not being very objective here. Yes, Castafiore song sang the wrong area. Yes. Tintin and the Scotsie. Yes, thank you, Jean-Sébastien. Yeah. It was Asterix who came to Scotland in 2014, Astérix chez les Pictes, where Jean-Yves Ferry has said that can be read as a pro-independence album. But then that's only what he's said, and yeah. Can I speak on Tintin's popularity in Asian countries? Gilbert, that is The nearest I came to that was reading the. So the quick answer to that, Gilbert, is no, because I don't know enough about it, but I wish I did. Why is Tintin so popular in Asian countries when you might say, well, there's clearly no assimilation? Perhaps because there is that exoticism. Is there sometimes it appeals when it reminds us of us, and then it appeals when it reminds us of the cliches of a far off place? Again, I was very, very interested to see that in the Arab world, Tintin is considered to be part of their culture rather than being a translated culture. Adam Kern suggests that a transnational approach to studying comics using the similarities between Tintin and Snowy with Japanese Shokan and the pet squirrel is a point of comparison. So yeah, I think that's a far better answer to Gilbert's question than mine. If some of Tintin's main influences are not Belgian, how do you think that might change our readings of the bande dessinée, particularly in light of his adventures in foreign lands? What we do see is development. That Tintin, I would, to put it crudely, behaves a lot better as he goes on. And in the later albums, he's very much assimilating to different cultures, whereas in the earlier albums, he's trying to take over those cultures. So to some extent, the Tintin could be read as a corpus and as a development, both of Tintin, of Hergé, and of maybe Western culture. If Tintin was originally intended to teach political lessons, Tintin au Congo, Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, what lessons would you say that the later albums teach? Ellie, yeah, I'd say that they teach the lessons that Hergé seems to have learned, and that he developed himself. He developed a close friendship with Chang. He very much became open to Oriental philosophy. And to some extent, we are going to see the development of an individual behind the development of a character. Jonathan, as a Scot, I'd be interested to know how you think the vision of Scotland in Tintin's trip compares with what we see in Asterix chez les Pictes. Interested. Yes, the Asterix chez les Pictes, there's a specific frame which Jean-Yves pointed to where Panoramics Getafix refers to the invaders, and he says that was a reference that he put in there specifically for that. With the Scottish trip, I think it's more exoticism, that it was based very much on the Buchan book, the 39 Steps, and the Hitchcock version of that. And to some extent, the Highlands of Scotland was still very much this exotic wilderness within Europe. I find that not all of my students can project themselves into Tintin's adventures. That's really interesting. Melissa, I would be really, really interested to see how people of different backgrounds. I mean, one of on a very obviously there were racial issues here, gender issues, but also one of the base questions has always been why was Tintin never quite as popular in North America as in Europe. Is that the same question? Was Tintin the original comic with a leading hero and animal, or did Hergé draw inspiration for that from a pre-existing work? There were various inspirations that have been put forward. Hergé did a series called Quick Fleu, I think, and there Tobor, I believe, I'd have to check all of this, was a stereotypical character. So there are books by Michael Farr which looks into the potential inspirations for Tintin. Is this talk being translated to the ECA publication in the works? No, but if you go into ECA, in the next issue, there's a really interesting article by Philippe Delisle in which he looks at the early albums and without justifying, tries to explain the unsavory political bias in some of those. I think it's the best, if you're looking for a way of justifying the non-justifiable bits of Tintin, I think Philippe Delisle does as good a job as anyone can do. Tutor, thank you, Annick, that was it.
Really, I'm sorry I have to interrupt at this point, but the class is drawing to an end and I'm teaching after this. But thank you so incredibly much for your time, for this very thoughtful presentation. I think my students would gratefully give you a round of applause.
Thank you.
There you go.
Nice to see you in a real life situation. Just to say, Francois has got my email, and I'd be more than delighted if any of you want to send me emails. This is what I do for fun, so please do get in contact. If there's anything I've said which maybe you haven't felt quite, don't quite dare put it into the open chat, but you'd like to ask me, just send me an email. I'd really appreciate that.
And it bears mentioning that we recorded your talk. So if anyone who was present wants the copy of that to show to their students, just shoot me an email and I'll gladly pass it along.
Great. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much, Billy. I'll talk to you soon.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Francois.
Bye, everyone.